Started. My name is Neha. I'm the Outreach Fellow here at the Entrepreneurship Center. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'm really excited to introduce you to our guest here in just a minute. But first, I just want to give you a rundown of the format of what's happening here today. So I'm going to start by introducing our guest, and then we'll engage in a brief interview so everyone can hear his story and just get a sense of what his entrepreneurial journey has been like so far. And then we'll head into a Q&A where you'll all have the opportunity to introduce yourselves and ask any questions you have here for Doug. So our questions from me will largely be based on our Miller Center entrepreneurial thinking pillars, which you can see on the wall over there. If you want to just take a second. We base everything we do here at the EC based on those pillars because we believe they're essential in developing the skills and mindset of an entrepreneur. And we are also going to be placing them in the chat online. So for those of you on Zoom, you'll also be able to take a look at the pillars we're talking about. All right, so with that being said, I'm super excited to introduce our guest, Doug Bunch, here today. So just a little bit about Doug. Doug graduated from William & Mary in 2002 with degrees in government and Latin before getting a Master of Education degree in Administration, Planning, and Social Policy at Harvard University in 2003, and another JD from William & Mary Law School in 2006. So Doug then used his background in education and law to help enforce federal laws that protect students from discrimination on the basis of race, gender, age, and disability before becoming the co-founder and chairman of the Global Playground. Global Playground is a nonprofit organization with a mission to raise awareness and share resources with people in developing countries through building educational infrastructure and working with local teachers in countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Central America. So in addition to being the chairman of Global Playground, Doug is currently a partner at Cohen, Milstein, Sellers, and Toll PLLC, where he prosecutes U.S. corporations for violations of federal security laws. And he also serves on William & Mary's Board of Visitors, as well as the boards of 3 other education-focused nonprofits. So you might see him around the next few days for Charter Day. Doug, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Great to, let's see, right here. Yeah. Great to be here and happy Charter Day. How many people are going to the Charter Day ceremony on Friday? Come on. That's great, fantastic. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I was saying thanks so much for having me.
Yes, of course. Thank you for being here. So let's start at the beginning. Growing up, what were some of your interests? What led you to your entrepreneurial journey today?
I think that when I was at William & Mary, I had a strong interest in education and a strong interest in law, and I was having trouble deciding between them. And I think that for some reason, I felt like I had to choose. And I think the most powerful realization I had was that I didn't have to choose. I could combine them in unique and powerful ways. So when I left William & Mary, I went to Harvard. I got a master's in education with a focus on higher ed policy. And then returned to William & Mary and got a law degree. And I really wanted to work at the intersection of law and education. And I think the common thread in both interests was that I wanted to help people. And Global Playground was sort of a byproduct of that along the way. Ultimately, when I joined a firm in DC, the firm where I work now, I realized that I was surrounded by young professionals who also wanted to give back. And I thought about how I could take the skills I developed, the expertise that I had gained from my experiences in education and in law and policy, and build an organization that could help give back. The co-founder of Global Playground is a William & Mary 2003 alum, Edward Brannigan, and he had experience teaching English in Bosnia and Costa Rica. And we had traveled together to the developing world, to Uganda to begin. We saw the impact that even a small investment in education could have in those places. And we thought, wow, what if we could raise enough of money to build a school and then use a school in Uganda maybe another school in Cambodia or Thailand or Honduras or elsewhere in the world, use those schools as launch pads to engage kids with each other in cross-cultural dialogue. What would that be like? And so that's how Global Playground sort of was born, with the vision of building this educational infrastructure and then using it as a platform to engage kids in conversation with each other.
Yeah, it's a really cool story. You mentioned that you wanted to combine your law and education degrees, but your first undergraduate degrees you got here were government and not right. Did
Yes.
you always know that you wanted to combine all four of those, or was that, how does that play into Global Playground?
No, I didn't. And I government was, I felt like, would prepare me to enter a career in law. In retrospect, there are a lot of other career majors at William & Mary that could have prepared me to enter law as well. But I think the one thing that I learned pretty late at college that I wish someone had told me at the beginning is that I didn't have to know necessarily what I wanted to do on day one. I think William & Mary students, and I've interacted with a lot of as I've been on the board and even before that as an alum, and even during my time here, my friends and I felt like, we had to have a direct path. We had to know exactly what we wanted to do. We had to remain on course. We had to get there. And I think the best opportunities that have happened to me in life are ones that I didn't see coming, I didn't expect. And none of which I ever could have planned for. So be willing, I think, the lesson, I think, is to be willing to veer off that direct course. Be willing to be flexible, tolerate ambiguity, one of your pillars. All of these are keys to remaining open to possibility in a career path. And that's what I did. That's how I got from being a Latin major to being a partner at a litigation firm, suing corporations and running an international NGO.
Definitely one of the more interesting stories we've had here. Everyone seems to have this crazy journey from their undergraduate degree to their current career. So while you were a student at William & Mary, you also founded a different organization called Asanius, the Youth Classics
That's
Institute.
right. Yeah.
So how did founding that influence your later journey to Global Playground?
And I am really impressed by this question. This required some serious research. Asanius was actually my Monroe project as a William & Mary undergraduate. And the idea was to create a program that would teach Latin and Greek to elementary school kids. And we hosted this for several summers in Augusta County, Virginia. And then at that point, the organization was called the Augusta County Institute for Classical Studies. And then we renamed it once it got large enough that other school districts started asking for it. And it still exists to this day. I'm still on its board. I'm not involved in the day-to-day nearly as much as I once was. We thought about merging it with another organization, but then a very generous former Latin teacher in Philadelphia died and left us a lot of money. So we recommitted it to the purpose of the organization, and it's going strong. What did it teach me about Global Playground? A lot. Most importantly, very practically speaking, how to navigate the 501c3 application process. I actually have given presentations about this as part of conferences that Student Leadership and Development here on campus runs. But knowing what forms to fill out at the IRS, what forms to fill out at the state level, what to expect from the IRS, what to expect from the state, and how to move all this towards a 501c3 designation was a powerful lesson that I learned at Asanius that I was able to apply really quickly to Global Playground to get it off the ground, almost down to a science. And a lot of organizations, I think, are at their inception are daunted by this notion that, oh my gosh, do I need a lawyer? What do I do? I don't even understand these forms. The truth is that it's pretty straightforward. And it's something that is accessible, certainly, was to me as a college student, and is to all of you if you wanted to create a 501c3. So shoot me an email if you want me to send you my presentation. But it's a really straightforward thing to do, and I wouldn't have known that had I not had the Asanius experience.
Was there anything you learned to not do with Global Playground? Any challenges?
The Global Playground, you mean what that I learned from Global Playground or from Estanius? Or from Estanius? I think that one thing I learned is to, again, to be flexible and to improvise as I'm looking at your wall of entrepreneurial thinking. Estanius, was sort of restricted by the funding sources we had, either through donations or the money we were allowed to charge students. We were also dependent on local school divisions to invite us or to agree to host this program. I think Global Playground, the way we designed it from the inception was to be more scalable and more nimble and more adaptable such that we can build however many schools we want a year. We can engage however many volunteers at those schools we want a year. And if we build 3 schools or 1, or even just spend the time during the year cultivating relationships with the existing school, it's not as if we've failed in the eyes of our constituents, in the eyes of donors, in the eyes of Global Playground's audience, because we're not dependent on one program, one funding source, 2 weeks during the summer at one school division in Virginia. It's more scalable, it's more nimble, and not being so dependent on one sort of path is a lesson that we learned, I think, when we applied at Global Playground.
You mentioned funding challenges. What are some other challenges you face with Global Playground being a nonprofit organization?
I was thinking about this on the way here. I think the largest one that we faced and the one that we took very active steps to correct was a sort of fundamental insustainability in how involved board members were as opposed to the executive director and staff of the organization. The founding board of the organization was doing things like designing our website and designing t-shirts and, out asking for money, as a board should do, but they were going beyond that and really dictating sort of the day-to-day work of the organization, which you might think to yourself, oh, that's great, the board is so involved, but it's not great for the executive director and for the staff trying to do their jobs. And so we had a very dramatic shift, I think, probably 5 years, 6 years in, where we essentially brought fresh blood in terms of board members of the organization and adopted a new culture of letting the executive director do their thing, holding them accountable at the end of the day, but having the board in charge of setting the vision and looking at the organization in broad strokes to make sure that we're headed the right direction rather than being involved in the day-to-day.
So what role do you play as part of that, like executive director and board of directors?
Yeah, I mean, over time, when we've had executive directors that have been sort of less involved, as for example, Edward, my co-founder, served as executive director for a while, and then he went to graduate school and he had less bandwidth to give to the organization. I was essentially functioning as board chair, as executive director for all intents and purposes. And then slowly, what we did is we brought on people who had been teaching fellows, so they volunteered at our schools abroad. And just to be clear, I don't know if everyone knows this about the organization, but we have schools to date in Uganda, Cambodia, Thailand, Honduras, Vietnam, Myanmar, Kenya, the Philippines, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Bangladesh. And so the first few of those were really the sites where our teaching fellows would work. And those teaching fellows, depending on how long they stayed with us, might then become global fellows, which means, actually, I would love to do this as an undergraduate. They got to, or as a recent graduate, they got to spend 3 months at at least 4 different project sites around the world. And their job was to connect the kids at those sites with each other. So then we got smart and we said, why don't we promote one of them to be a deputy executive director? Then we had someone sort of running the day-to-day of the organization. And then we said, why don't we promote her, Kendall Lorenzen, I don't know if you know her name, to executive director, and we did. And then we had another former teaching fellow, serve as executive director, Ryan Drysdale, and now we just invited yet another former teaching fellow, William Mary alum, Amanda Cordray, to be our current executive director. But I think that all of those people, I think, have brought their own sort of vision to the organization in ways that I think have been really productive.
So as you mentioned earlier, Global Playground is a more scalable organization, and you're talking about these different changes with bringing different people into higher positions. How has your mission to raise awareness and create educational opportunities kind of evolved over that journey?
Repeat the very last part of what you said.
Just how has your mission evolved, and how do you achieve?
Our mission, I mean, we're really proud of this. Our mission has remained the same since day one. What's changed is our strategic plan and 5-year plan. So if you think about Global Playground as sort of a pyramid in terms of our strategic vision, the top of the pyramid is our mission. To raise awareness and share resources with people of the developing world that don't have educational opportunities. Then sort of the next step down is our strategic vision, strategic plan on how we accomplish that. And then even more detail, at the very base of the pyramid, is a much broader list of ways that we're going to accomplish that in the next 5 years. And we would develop sort of spreadsheets to track, kind of like a dashboard, you might say, to track what we accomplished along the way. And the strategic plan and the 5-year plan have changed immensely. But what has not changed is the mission.
It's really impressive considering it is a great mission.
The key is to frame it broadly. If you frame it broadly, then you can connect all sorts of things to it. Now, we've realized along the way that different aspects, different outgrowths of the mission have been things that we might not want to, we've thought about pursuing and we've rejected as options. So for example, we build schools in these places, and it's very tempting to move from building schools to buying books or raising money to buy shoes, or the list goes on. These people are people in need. And we made a really firm decision not to cross that line, not to begin trying to do everything for them, but build the infrastructure and then work with the local government and other local nonprofits to run the schools, supply the materials to the schools, that kind of thing. We can't be all things to all people. And it was important for us to realize that very early on, to realize our limitations.
So like you just mentioned, unfortunately, this is a really big systemic problem. So how do you define and measure the success of your organization?
I think that one numerical means of doing this is the number of students that go through Global Playground schools, which I think we estimated around 20,000 now. That's a basic measure. But also, I think the quality of education at these schools is something that we care deeply about. Our school in Uganda has actually gotten awards among in their region for the quality of education at the school. And we're really proud of those types of things. Also, some of the schools have, even since, to use Uganda as an example, some schools have also found other ways to give back to the community. And so, for example, when we built the school in Uganda, it was going to have electricity, and we wanted there to be a way for people to charge their cell phones. And so we made sure that outlets were accessible to people in the community.
Okay, well, one last question. Which one of our entrepreneurial pillars of thinking, as I said, they're out there, everyone else also wants to take a look, which one would you want to work on leveraging more in any aspect of your life, whether that's your career?
Yeah,
or personal life?
I think that the two in the top left-hand corner are the most important: openness to risk and tolerance for ambiguity. And I wish someone very early on had given us explicit permission to do those things, because it would have made our pain, it would have eased our pain in ways that, as I think back, would have been pretty remarkable for us. But I think that, like all good William & students, we expected this to be seamless and expected this to, not to hit any bumps in the road, and we we're going to sail right to where we wanted to be. And the truth is that we didn't know what we were doing when we started. No one told us how to create a nonprofit. No one told us how to work with other organizations to build schools in these places. No one warned us that we'd be dealing with such complex problems that varied so much across the world, that each required us to adapt the work that we did in these countries in unique ways. None of that is not anything we could have predicted. We were dependent in many ways on our partners in these countries, dependent on political forces beyond our control, dependent on environmental forces in some cases beyond our control. And that necessarily required us to be open to this and to tolerate ambiguity. And those were lessons we learned the hard way. So I think it's, it would have been really refreshing had someone given us permission at the beginning to accept risk and to tolerate ambiguity.
That's some good advice, especially for our EC members here who might be starting their entrepreneurial journey. I think that puts us in a really great place to start our Q&A. So anyone here in the hub, feel free to raise your hand, introduce yourselves, ask that there's some questions, or anyone on Zoom, you can also contribute by raising your hand, or if you want to DM Alekia a question, she can also ask it for you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Melody. And one question I had was because you're working on like building schools in these developing countries. One thing I think about like entrepreneurial thinking is kind of like getting out of this like in the box thinking that I think like traditional education puts us all in, and it's like trying to be more creative and like improvising and stuff like that. So have you been able to try and implement like entrepreneurial thinking in these schools that you're building, so that's not just like traditional, education, but that you can create like future, creative problem solvers?
Yeah, good question. One thing we don't do, and that we made sure that it was clear to the organization from the outset, is create. You don't want to set a curriculum for what a school should teach in a place like Cambodia. You don't think that we're equipped to do that. However, we did want to work in whatever framework existed locally to create cross-cultural dialogue among the students in schools. And so we've done that most vividly when we've had multiple teaching fellows on the ground in these schools, and they've found really entrepreneurial ways to do that. So for example, one thing that they did several years ago is thought of sort of themes that would bind kids in developing countries across their countries together in common. What do all of these kids experience in common? They all play. They all are subject to the environment and climate change. They all have a sense of community somehow. And what we then did is we engaged the kids in cross-cultural ways, in some cases without using the language because they couldn't understand each other, in exchanges of art and exchanges of videos and photos. We gave kids cameras to take home. And we sort of exchanged cross-cultural work product on these various themes. One really cool byproduct of that is that we were able to exhibit it to our donors through our website, through videos, through our annual events, that inspired them to give. And so that they could be sort of the audience too, in a different way. So it was that realization that we could use social media to do it, that sort of realization that was maybe one of the most entrepreneurial ways that we've changed the curriculum in the countries where we've worked.
Can I have the mic?
Oh my gosh, that is entrepreneurial.
So my question is, if we were to take your advice and try to get better at, say, tolerance for ambiguity right now, what are some of the things that you would advise us to do? Like, how can we get better at that over time? Do you have any suggestions for what we might do?
I think that you should. I would say two things. One is that one thing I think is true of a lot of William & Mary people is that we all have interests that in some cases are very varied and very diverse. And some may be interests that we pursue in the classroom. Others may be interests that we pursue outside the classroom in an extracurricular format. But I would think of ways that we can combine those diverse interests, not just so we do something at the intersection, but that we do something at the intersection of those and we benefit from the synergies that result. So I'm thinking there's a there's a book I read in graduate school called Making the Most of College. And they profile a student who is a biologist, and she is doing all this research on on the skeletal system, but she also she takes ballet, and she's looking for a unique way to combine the two. And she ends up studying sort of the stability of chicken bones when they're subjected to different types of pressures as a way of studying human anatomy and how different bones are subject to different stresses. And that's the kind of synergistic thinking, the kind of combining of interests that I think you all can do now, today. Go home and make a list of, the 5 different things that most interest you. And the more different they are from each other, the better. And then think of really cool ways that you can combine them and pursue unique research or unique entrepreneurial thinking at that intersection in ways that would go far beyond them both. That would be my one of my suggestions.
Thank you. That's awesome. I think doing that would also increase your openness to risk, because combining those dissimilar things, I think, is going to create some of those opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You talk into it now.
Right. So I'm William Wallace. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm excellent. Thanks for asking. I'm always fascinated by success, no matter how it happens. And you have a very successful story. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. I also would like to say that I could appreciate your discussion between the dynamics of a board, executive directors, CEOs, especially when you add to that staff and you also add to that volunteers. So I'm glad you were able to work through that. I did hear mission, and what I was listening for was your values. What type of values are you using to drive and brand your organization?
Number 1 is humility. Humility.
Okay.
And it's something that we have underscored for everyone. And to the point that we've actually created a required reading list for teaching folks. I mean, they have a lot of time to read, to be fair, when they go abroad. And we want them to understand that it's not about them, that they're there to listen, they're there to help, that they'll learn most about themselves in that moment, those moments when they feel most vulnerable in countries where they can't speak the language, they can't understand the culture. And their first job is to go and listen and absorb what they can, and then find ways to give back, find ways to help. For the longest time, we didn't have our photos of us on our website because we wanted the focus to be on the programs we were engaged in, kids who were helping. And we still try to keep that, to a fairly, minimal level. I remember an organization that we work with that has an executive director with somewhat large ego, I would say, sent out an email once, and the email, the graphic for his signature was really off, and his signature exploded to the width of the entire email. And they forwarded it to our volunteers and board, and I said, wow, isn't this emblematic of the leadership and the culture within this organization? That is the antithesis of global programming. It should always be. So I think humility is what drives us most. I think that curiosity too is something that is contagious when you're interacting with the kids that we're interacting with. I mean, they don't, kids in Uganda, they've never seen white people before, some of them, and they will come up to us and they can't figure out, they keep rubbing, well, is it black underneath? And that understanding that we're exposing them to viewpoints that are not ones they've been exposed to before, and that there's an innate curiosity that comes along with that. And, do your people go, I'm quoting from some of the questions that they asked us in 2006, I remember them. Do your people go to the moon? Do your people eat cabbage? What do you do when it rains? It's very curious, and it inspires your own curiosity. And remaining open to that curiosity, I think, is something that we learn, that we benefited from.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I don't think I need it. Tell us about the teaching fellows. Do you all hire them, where they come from?
Yeah.
How long they're there, what their qualifications, application process?
Good question. So it's a program that was at its height, I would guess maybe 5 to 6 years ago, and that we phased out in some countries, and I think that we're still willing to do in other countries as long as we can find the right people. There's a lot of trust that it takes to send mostly recent undergraduates and historically to our project sites abroad, and trust them to be ambassadors to us, to cultivate relationships with communities. And what we found over time is that either we sent people that were phenomenal, that blew it out of the water, or we sent people that went and came home within a couple months, and there was no in between. And it's really hard. We discovered we were investing a lot of time and energy and a lot of resources into finding the first category of people, and it created a lot of risk for the organization, especially when none of us, with the exception of even the executive director, is only part-time. It's hard for them to supervise all of what happens on the ground in these places. So I guess the short answer is that we don't have a formal application process any longer, but that we remain open to people approaching us and serving in these countries. You can think of it as our own version of the Peace Corps in many ways. So it's something we remain open to, and we're happy to discuss with any of you or anyone who finds out about the playground. But it'll take the right person.
It looks like we might have some questions on Zoom. Might be this right there.
What steps in the process of creating an entrepreneurial action say are different for a nonprofit versus a for-profit?
Well, very different. I think from the beginning, the main difference between I'll sort of put on my lawyer hat now. The main difference between a 501c3 and a for-profit corporation is what they do with the profit. A 501c3 puts the profit back into the organizational purpose, and a corporation keeps the profit and distributes it to its shareholders, or distributes it, if it's a private company, to its owners. The process of forming those is very different. I think both are supervised in most states by State Corporation Commission in Virginia, or parallel agencies in other states, but the application procedure is very different. Even among the varieties of for-profit entities, there are different types that you can form. You can form a LLC, or limited liability company. You can form a stock corporation with shareholders, or a private corporation without. There are different varieties, but the main difference is what they do with the profits. There are implications for taxes. There are also implications for whether people who give you money that and themselves deduct a percentage of that from their own taxes. So the differences are complex, and I think that I don't think that, at least in the first instance, it's so inaccessible that you couldn't learn about this by, for example, visiting the State Corporation Commission website, or looking at the IRS application in the case of a 501c3, or consulting a lawyer who does this on a pro bono basis.
All right, I have a question. So you are actively practicing law, you're the chairman of Global Playground, and you serve on all these different boards. how do you balance all of this? Or what advice would you have for someone who's maybe starting a venture alongside another job or school?
I have perfected the art of multitasking. It's constant. And it happens in really funny ways. Like I remember I was visiting our school in Thailand and I had to make this phone call at what would have been 5 a.m. Bangkok time. And it was because it was 5 p.m. in the United States, roughly. And I was making this call from the top of this mountain, and these women were walking behind me to go pick tea leaves in the fields, and there were roosters crowing everywhere. I thought, oh my gosh, am I really calling a plaintiff in a securities fraud case from the top of this mountain with this happening all around me? But I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. I don't think I'd be the same lawyer if it weren't for Global Playground. I don't think I would be the same chairman of Global Playground if it weren't for my experience as a lawyer. And I don't think I would be the same board member at William & Mary were it not for all of those experiences. So the synergies from those experiences are, I think, what drives me and what fuels my passion. But it's the multitasking is constant. I was yesterday. I was, I drove down here with a member of the board who carpools with me, who was just outside shooting me around, we we're sort of talking politics, and then I had 2 phone calls. One of which was we call them meet and confers. It was a negotiation with defendants. The defendant is a natural gas fracking company in Pennsylvania, and we had a relatively heated negotiation with them about producing some documents. By relatively heated, I mean there are people screaming and yelling at each other on the phone, and then had another call after that, and then got to Williamsburg and toured some residence halls, and then responded to some Global Playground emails, and had dinner with the president and the rest of the board last night, and then here we are doing it again today. So it's just that if I think sometimes about the scope of things that happens in a day in my life, on one hand it's daunting and scary. On the other hand, I love it. I love and no 2 days are the same. And the variability is one thing that I find really engaging.
I feel like you mentioned a lot of our entrepreneurial pillars in that story. Practicing all of them.
Yes.
I actually have another question. So you mentioned like a bunch of different countries where you have like your global playground schools. So, and I know you mentioned that like there are some traits that all of the children have in common, such as like wanting to play and building a community. But like, were there any challenges you faced that were like specific when you're opening a school in like a country that had like a very different culture? Like, were there any hurdles that maybe your the teachers going there had to face that like were different compared to another country that you maybe started out in?
Yeah, there are certainly cultural differences. Also, not all of the countries are the same in terms of relative access to things like clean water and things like electricity. Our school in Thailand, one of the ones where we work, would resemble to you, I think, a school not that much different from some middle schools and high schools you might find in the United States. And there's certain differences, but they had pretty decent access to water and electricity. On the other hand, I can think of like our school in northern Burma or Myanmar is the opposite. I mean, they are, it's the middle of nowhere. Any electricity they have is from solar energy. They're cut off in many ways from development. It's just very, very different. And the other schools run the gamut of in between. There are also schools that face certain very practical challenges. One of our schools in Thailand, the kids get to school by canoe. There are other ways to get there, but those ways take much longer, which means that if the weather doesn't cooperate, they may not get to go to school. I think there are other examples of challenges that face one country's youth or another uniquely. In Cambodia, high incidence of sex trafficking, and that's something that is a challenge that Cambodia and Southeast Asia, it seems, uniquely faces, at least compared to more so than some of our other countries. But I think there are sort of common challenges that they face. One thing I think is true is that in a lot of these developing communities, their focus is not on next year or next month or even next week. Their focus is on today, and that I think challenges us to encourage them to dream, to think past today in one sense. But it also has an upside of, for example, in Vietnam, being very, very forgiving. I mean, our school in Quezon, in Vietnam is in Quezon, which is was an American base in the Vietnam War. I mean, the unexploded ordnances that are still in the ground there have American flags on them. We put that there. The napalm that's still in the soil, we put there. And I'll never forget, we walked around the community the day that we opened the school. And there was a woman who looked at us and she said, my husband fought against the United States in the war, but we're so happy you're here. And so happy that you're giving us the school. There's a certain forgiveness that happens because they care about today. These are basic needs: education, food, water. But being sensitive to those differences, I mean, the kids are so different. And in Uganda and in Honduras, the kids are very outgoing, very outgoing. I mean, they'll run up and hug you and in Thailand in particular, students are extraordinarily respectful. When you walk past them, they'll walk lower than you to show respect. And learning those cultural differences is part of humility. It's part of being willing to absorb and listen.
You said you pride yourself on the level of education you give. I'm just wondering how you control that quality with so many different locations.
Yeah, I'd say we don't. Just to clarify, I'm not sure that we pride ourselves as much as we're proud of the schools that have the high quality of education, because they're the ones doing the teaching. They're the ones that set the curriculum. They're the ones that. But in terms of encouraging them, I think that the answer to your question is that we stay in touch with the communities and cultivate relationships with them, such that if they do need, for example, solar panels to power computers, then it's something we're willing to fund, on an ad hoc basis, and that we have, again, without crossing the line, giving them, everything that they need to run the school. So we have, through those ongoing relationships, made investments in the schools subsequent to the launch of the infrastructure. And I keep saying infrastructure because these are not all schools. Some are libraries, some are technology centers. They're all forms of educational infrastructure. But through those ongoing relationships, we keep tabs on what they need. And if they need something that would improve the quality of education, we try to give it to them.
Well, I have one final question. Do you have a favorite story of an impact that Global Playground has had, either something you've heard or experienced yourself?
I think that one powerful impact that we often underestimate is the impact on the volunteers and on board members of Global Playground and the people that have been involved in running it. The impact that the communities where they've worked has had on them. And there's a William & Mary student, 2005 grad, who just went down and attended the wedding of one of the kids who was in his host family. Think about that. And then brought his host mother to Roatan, which is an island off the coast of Honduras, she never would have been able to go to had it not been for that relationship. But these relationships are so fundamental to the experience and so important that they're relationships for life. I mean, you know, Honduras is probably the project site I've visited most just because it's closest and it's easiest to get to go on a long weekend. And you know, I still have relationships in that community. Same with Thailand. And those relationships are what allow us to, you know, to continue to help them, and they have an impact on us.
Does anyone have any final questions? Great. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your story and your advice for everyone. Just a few final things before we wrap up. We're going to put the check-in form up again in case you guys didn't get to do it at the beginning. Just if you could check in, whether you're a member or not, just to let us know you were here. And then after that, we'll also put up a feedback form, and we really appreciate some feedback on the event. It's a really quick one, just a few questions. And if you fill it out and you're an EC member, you'll also get some points towards liftoff and you can earn swag with that. So we will put up the form. Oh, no, you're right. And we'll be putting both of these links in the chat as well for whoever needs it. And last, just a heads up about some stuff we're going to be doing here at the EC. We're not going to be having a rocket pitch tomorrow because of Charter Day, but next Friday, the 18th, we'll have our regularly scheduled rocket pitch at 2 p.m. And next Wednesday, the 16th, we're going to be having our community hangout event at 6:30. So we hope to see everyone there. That is the end of our first AFS for the semester.
And see everybody at Charter Day tomorrow, I hope.
Also, we do still have some pizza, so if anyone wants to get some food, go ahead.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes, we're trying to.
You know what?
Thank you.
I have not. Well, no, I know it's something we're asking for from the General Assembly, right?
Right.
I've seen this.
Yeah, so.
I know.